In this video, I'll be talking about the character Curley's wife from John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. This isn't absolutely everything about her character, but it's definitely what I think are the most important aspects, and certainly things that you would want to explore in a response to an exam question should she come up. I think when writing an exam response to a character question, obviously you start with your introduction, but I think your first main body paragraph really should start with your initial impression of a character. Not always, sometimes characters do not change, but often characters do change, or at least our perception of them changes over the course of a text. So you'll want to start with your initial impression and then show how that's developed and how that changes or doesn't change in your essay, and that helps show your knowledge of the text. So I'm starting with our initial impression, which is the fact that she is promiscuous. We learn that firstly through the opinion of Candy, who I would argue is biased. He calls her a tart, says that she's got the eye, talks about her looking at Slim as an example. So we initially have preconceived ideas of what she's like through Candy, and then we meet her, and you might argue that some of her actions support this idea that Candy has already put in our minds, okay? And as an example, you might look at the fact that she has her body leaning against the door frame, and so her body is thrown forward, and as an example she has rouged lips. So what might you say about that? Her posture seems quite seductive as it's displaying her curves, and her red lips draw attention to a sensual part of her body. Red also symbolises passion and lust, as well as the fact that it symbolises danger, and that could foreshadow the trouble she will bring. That I've put as a question mark. We'll come back to that, because does she actually bring the trouble? As a reminder, this is 1930s America. This is a patriarchal society in which a wife was expected to be domesticated and entirely loyal to her husband. So Curley's wife's apparent flirtatious behaviour would depict Curley as weak and incapable of controlling his wife, and could explain, if you recall in chapter 2, Candy mentions that Curley has become even more aggressive since marrying Curley's wife, and maybe it's out of frustration because he can't control her as much as he hoped. George, after meeting Curley's wife, seems to hold the same impression as Candy does. By calling her jailbait, he calls her poison and a tramp, and tells Lenny to stay away from her. So he sees her beauty as something dangerous that could get men into trouble. So you could argue at the very beginning she appears to be a femme fatale stock character, and what I mean by that is her character seems to be very cliched. We have seen this character, this two-dimensional character, being used in multiple movies and novels and so on. And it's where a woman who's incredibly beautiful uses that beauty to lure men into disastrous situations. You could even argue that there are parallels drawn between Curley's wife and Eve. Here we're referring to the Christian story of the Garden of Eden. And basically, you don't need to know anything in great detail, but Eve is a symbol of temptation. And you might argue that she brings the downfall of mankind. And so certainly at this moment, you might argue we have this two-dimensional presentation of Curley's wife, but you should be reading through the lines and you should be critically analysing this, okay? I have read lots of student answers that only look at Curley's wife in this way, where she is promiscuous, she's trouble, and it's her fault that she dies, and therefore it's also her fault that Lenny dies, and she's just this symbol of temptation. That is very, I would argue, very limited, and you're not going to get high marks for that. So you'll want to critically analyse that. So here are some things that you might want to consider. One, she is the only woman on the ranch. So who else is she supposed to look at? So we have Candy saying she's got the eye. Well, no, she's just looking at the people on the ranch and they all happen to be men. So that is one argument. What does he want her to do? Look down at her feet, look down at the floor in a submissive way, lock herself away in the house where she belongs, as you can imagine kind of that patriarchal mentality might be. And you also have to bear in mind, thinking about her physical appearance and the fact that she's wearing lots of makeup and she's got all these, she's got ostrich feathers and she's wearing red. She has grown up in a patriarchal society that objectifies women and encourages the notion that a woman's worth is derived from their physical appearance. So, of course, you might argue that she has internalized those sexist views about women. She objectifies herself as well and thinks her only worth comes from looking pretty, and so she puts all her effort into her physical appearance. It doesn't mean that she's promiscuous, it doesn't mean she's going to cheat on her husband, but it's the only way she feels she can be worth anything in this society. Don't forget as well, 1930s had a lot of glamorous Hollywood female stars, who were heavily made up and wore all these glamorous outfits and beautiful hairstyles, and she's grown up with that, and she's grown to aspire to be them as well. She mentions that to Lenny later on in chapter 5. So she's just trying to imitate the female stars that she's grown up watching, but she's also just trying to live up to the standards of society that has been set for women. So she can't win. Women were objectified and expected to look purty, as Lenny said, and good looking, as Slim said, for men, yet when she does make an effort, she's labelled a tramp. I want to really look at this term jailbait, which is what George used as well, to quickly define what jailbait is. It's what you describe a young girl who is beautiful as, who men would be tempted by and would enter a sexual relationship in and find themselves in jail. That's where it comes from. It's this idea that a girl who is under the legal age to have sex is beautiful, so beautiful that a man can't say no, apparently, and they end up in jail, okay? So really think about the issues with that derogatory term. It really exposes the inequality of men and women at the time, and if you hear anyone using that, you should hold them to account and really question what they mean by that, because it excuses men for their behaviour by assuming they have no control over their sexual urges. So this derogatory term places the blame on Curley's wife for being beautiful and therefore being a temptation for the men on the ranch. Steinbeck's description of Curley's wife gives greater attention to her physical appearance than any other character, and this is throughout the novella. So he doesn't place as much emphasis on anyone else's physical appearance. So that in itself highlights how objectified women were. There are two camps of looking at this. You can either look at Steinbeck doing that on purpose to emphasise how objectified women were, or is it the fact that Steinbeck is a product of a patriarchal society because he lived in the 1930s and therefore he does it without even realising, and he's only created these two-dimensional female characters with very little identity? That's another way of looking at it. Even her action of running to Crook's room, this is an example, okay? So she runs to Crook's room, or we assume she does, and she's out of breath. But her actions are sexualized. Her lips are described as slightly parted, and she breathed strongly. So you might question how a woman whose every action is eroticized doesn't use their sexuality for some leverage in a world where they have such little power. And you can link that as well to the fact that we talked about her body was thrown forward. Maybe she is casually leaning on the doorframe. But from a male perspective, because they can only see women as a sexual object in this novel, they're going, oh God, what a flirt, she's showing her cleavage. Okay, but she just means to lean against a doorframe because maybe she's tired. So she can't get away from this like heavily sexualized description of her. And so you might argue, if she wants to have any attention in this world, she has to play up to that. She has to use her sex appeal because nothing else will attract attention. It's important to note also the hypocrisy of the men in being so judgmental of Curley's wife. because they give more respect to the girls in the local brothel than they do her. And just break this down. What has she done wrong? She has attempted to talk to the men. She's worn makeup. She's worn red. That's about it. Okay? And maybe her posture has been a little flirtatious. She's just being informal. But they speak of her with such contempt. And if you contrast that to the way they speak of old Susie in the local brothel, then, you can see that inequality between them. Even her husband chooses to spend the night with prostitutes than be with Curley's wife. So she just can't win. She's put in this impossible situation. And then what I would say in your essay, you really want to then explore this human side of her. What else do we learn about her, and how can we explain away these ideas of her being promiscuous? So as an example, yes, she makes an effort to look attractive, but is that really to attract men for sexual gratification, or is it actually just to get some attention because she needs companionship? So as an example, she continually says, I'm looking for Curley throughout the novel, and they're never together. So the fact that this married couple are never together emphasizes the distance between them. And of course, as a result, that means that Curley's wife is incredibly isolated on a ranch full of men, and where she doesn't feel welcome at all. This is at a time when married women were encouraged to stay at home and to protect male work. So just to go into that in a bit more detail, this is the Great Depression, and remember the Dust Bowl is happening as well. We have very few jobs for a lot of men that are looking, and so it was frowned upon if a married woman was to take employment, because it was seen as the married woman taking away a job from a man who needed to provide for his family. So it's not like she can go to work. So she just leads this incredibly lonely life because all she has is her husband, and her husband doesn't even spend any time with her. He would rather spend time with a prostitute than with his own wife. Look at her. Look at where she stands in relation to the men. In chapter 2, she looks into the bunkhouse. In chapter 4, she stood still in the doorway of Crooks's room. So this is a symbol of her marginalisation. A man and woman's world were seen as separate, and she's not welcomed by the men. And then, of course, it all comes out in chapter 5 when she really opens up to Lenny. By the way, I should mention, I think it's so important that just before her death, she's with Lenny and no other character when she opens up. Because I think Lenny, as we know, is seen as really childish, naive, innocent. There's nothing sexual about Lenny. And if this was with any other character, if it was with Slim, if it was with George, she could still be interpreted as flirting. So I think this is so important that this happened with Lenny, so that we know there's no ulterior motive. She just wanted companionship. So she says, I never get to talk to nobody, I get awful lonely. So this is her revealing her real plight, which is loneliness. Because the men at least have each other, and she just doesn't have anyone. And this revelation really makes Curley's wife so human, rather than this two-dimensional femme fatale character that she was initially presented to us as. And of course she's oppressed, okay? Think about the time that she's living in. So the fact that Curley's wife is the only female on the ranch, as an example, accentuates this image, if you like, of the woman trapped in a misogynistic world of men. So maybe Steinbeck did that on purpose, to just have one woman on this ranch to highlight how overpowering men were in society, and how public life was led by men. We never know her name. We just know her as Curley's wife. So that really indicates the little agency she has. She's referred to by the possessive pronoun, emphasising her objectification. She belongs to Curley, and also the lack of identity that she has. Coulson, chapter 3, says to Curley, why not you tell her to stay the hell home where she belongs? The anger in the men over Curley's wife being near them, wearing makeup, speaking to them, all these little things that shouldn't derive such an angry response, is really representative of a patriarchal world where men are fixated on dominating females in every aspect. So she's not doing exactly what they want, and that infuriates them. For example, she doesn't stay at home on her own. That annoys them. She knows where she stands in all this. When she's with Lenny, Candy and Crooks, remember that's an elderly member of the ranch, someone with mental health issues, and a black man. She knows that they're all the weak ones, and she mentions it in chapter 4. So she knows her weak position. She belongs to the outcasts of 1930s society. But look what she does. And I've put this under oppress because I feel like this is a product of oppression. When she says to Crooks, I could get you strung upon a tree so easy it ain't even funny. So, this is her preying on the fact that Crooks is black, and you might argue the weakest member on that ranch because of that. It's the only person she's got power over, and it's her chance to feel the tiniest bit of power in a world where she feels completely powerless, or almost completely. So Steinbeck is emphasising how power grows from weakness, and that's maybe calling into question the society in which we have created, okay? It makes people cruel. The world that we've created, where to be powerful, you must make sure other people are below you and weak, and you must keep them down there and exploit that weakness. This is how people become cruel. And then thinking right at the end, this really bugs me. I still get angry about this. She dies and Candy is standing over her dead body shouting, "You goddamn tramp, you done it, didn't you?" It's her fault, apparently, according to Candy. But it's important to keep in mind that this has been foreshadowed. The fact that Lenny is dangerous right from the beginning. His petting problem is highlighted throughout the novella. He kills a mouse. He kills a dog. We learn that he got into trouble in weed because he wouldn't let go of a girl's dress. So this was foreshadowed. This was inevitable, yet it is still, according to Candy, Curley's wife's fault. So the lack of emotion at this scene of her death, especially from her husband doesn't even really spend any time with her. He's more interested in hunting down Lenny. Highlights the lack of worth given to her, and also the normalisation of violence against women. Despite all of this, she's a dreamer. And it's sadly ironic, really, that her dream is to make a name for herself in the movies, and this is a nameless character. And even that just tells us how futile that dream is in such a harsh world, which was 1930s America. And then look at some things that she said. She feels like she was close to her dream twice. He says I could go with that show. He says he was going to put me in the movies. But in both instances, think about the fact that she depended on a man to make her dream come true. It highlights the limits women had over the trajectory of their lives. And it's also likely, we don't know for sure, she thinks that her mother stole her letters. But the likelihood is those letters didn't exist, okay? And the likelihood is, I would argue, that these men were lying to her in order to be in her favour, which mirrors the way the weak in all aspects of society are exploited by the powerful. And there is a parallel between her and other characters, especially George and Lenny. Her dream, just like George and Lenny's, is her mental escape from a cruel world. Unfortunately, her dream is futile, much like the American dream, and her only escape from the world is death, when meanness, the discontent, the ache for attention leaves her face. And that's really sadly ironic, isn't it? That's the only time when she is at peace, is when she's dead. And there's this element of, this is such a cruel, cruel world. So you always want to think about Steinbeck's overall intention. So you could focus on gender relations with this. So she does represent the struggles of women in a misogynistic society, and how the Great Depression forced women into a life of loneliness. But you could think even more general, okay? Think about, is this is this Steinbeck's comment on human nature. Like I said, power is born out of weakness. So the men see her as a scapegoat. They have very little power in their lives, so it's easy to pick on Curley's wife because she's weak, and that makes them just feel a tiny bit powerful in what is really a life where they have very little agency. And then of course we've seen that with Curley's wife, with the way that she turned to be so cruel towards Crooks. She has very little power. This is the tiniest bit of power she has, and she uses it, and it makes her feel good for a small moment. But of course, she can only feel powerful if she makes someone else feel weak, and in this case it was Crooks. I'm sure there are other intentions that you might want to explore, and feel free to share them in the comment section. I always like to hear your own ideas.